Welcome, everybody, to the final session of our seminar on Little Essays Towards Truth. Do What Thou Wilt Shall Be the Whole of the Law. And this is, of course, the final chapter, which is, in fact, entitled Truth. So let's see what is to be seen about this. So let me bring up the, oops. Let's bring up our screen. Here we go. All right. So in this final chapter, Aleister Crowley is going to re-summarize the basic argument of the book in relation to a number of passages from this text called the Chaldean Oracles of Zoroaster, or maybe more properly, the Chaldean Oracles of Pseudo-Zoroaster, because they're not actually written by Zoroaster, although the text is attributed to him. And let me just explain for a minute before we look at our text what exactly this text, the Chaldean Oracles, is, because this is a key scripture, if you will, of Neoplatonism in late antiquity. And it's really a text from the late antiquity, kind of the 1st to 3rd century, but it's back attributed to ancient times. And basically what it is a set of what are called oracles, but it's a set of descriptions of the noumenal hypostatic levels of the different realms of the way the realm of the forms in Platonism is divided up. So in the older form of Platonism, you've got basically 2 levels. You've got the material world and then the realm of forms, which is the supernatural spiritual world. What happens in Neoplatonism is that there's a development of increasing complexity in what are called the hypostatic levels, basically these intermediary supernatural levels between the ultimately divine one and the plane of material visible reality. And so the Chaldean oracles are a collection of visionary texts that describe these various levels and their relationship to each other and how you're supposed to interact with them through the theurgic ritual rites of the pagan temple cultus. And so this was a very important text to the Neoplatonic philosophers, particularly Proclus, who's a little bit later than the period in question. But this is also a text that was known earlier to kind of the generation of the Iamblichus and so forth. So this is a text that was used in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. William Wynne Westcott had a edition of this that he put together and then published in a set of publications that he was working on called the Collectanea Hermetica. That also includes a translation of the Sefer Yetzirah. And these texts that he published and edited were used in the Golden Dawn as part of the teachings of the order. And so there's a number of citations, particularly in, I think, the Practicus and Philosophus grades in the Golden Dawn, in which these texts get used and have a kind of prominent role. And so, and they particularly relate to the Platonic legacy of the Golden Dawn. And so this is a text that's important to Crowley because Thelema is specifically a kind of revision of Hermeticism, but it's also a modern updating of it. And so he's trying to use these ancient texts, but also update them in the sense that he's trying to overcome the kind of naive dualism, metaphysical dualism that the Platonic tradition has in these texts, because that kind of dualism is a legacy of the old eon, the eon of Osiris, that's supposed to be reformed in the new eon. And what I mean by that is that the kind of dualism involves worship of the divine as a kind of being external or exterior to human existence. And in Thelema, there's a kind of more radical non-dualism between the human and the divine, where this distinction is to be gnostically collapsed. And so he's trying to use these Platonic texts and traditions, but also update and revise them in light of this new gnosis that he is promulgating in this sense. So in philosophy, this is called a hermeneutical repetition. So of course, hermeneutical just means interpretive. And then by repetition, this is a term that Martin Heidegger uses in Being and Time. He originally gets it from Kierkegaard, but he has a special sense that he gives it in his own philosophy. To stage a repetition in a hermeneutical sense means that when you're interpreting say an ancient text from the received tradition, what you're doing is you're bringing to light certain interpretive valences that are implicit to the text, but were never fully developed in the original historical context within which the text was originally written and understood. So you're kind of, as it were, bringing to light a possible interpretation of this text that does relate to the philosophical or thematic context that it represents, but it is in a sense a new or reinterpretation of the text in terms of the different conditions of modern life compared to, late antiquity, which is a very different society than we live in today. And so this is what Crowley is attempting to do in this final chapter, where he's picking out this particular text from the Hermetic tradition that his own magical system derives from. And he's showing how you can still read this text and approve of it, as it were, but you can also view it from a lens that reinterprets it in terms of the philosophy of Thelema that he is advocating. So in that spirit, let's take a look at the first paragraph of Truth. Hillary, if you could go ahead and read this full first paragraph here.
All right. What is truth? It is absurd to attempt to define it. For when we say that S is P rather than S is Q or S is R, we assume that we already know the meaning of truth. This is really why all the discussions as to whether truth depends on external correspondence, internal coherence, or whatnot, neither produce conviction nor withstand analysis. Briefly, truth is an idea of a super rational order pertaining to neshama, not to ruach. That all rational conceptions imply that we know truth and that truth is in their propositions only shows that these so-called rational ideas are not really rational at all. Truth is by no means the only idea that resists rational analysis. There are very many ideas that remain indefinable. All simple ideas do so. At the back of all of our efforts is the dead wall that we must already know what we are pretending to find out.
Okay, Crowley is making a basic point of hermeneutics, which is that Heidegger, of course, I've used this example several times during this course, but let me use it again. Heidegger says, for us to know what a tree is, to see a tree and know that it's a tree, in some sense, we have to already know what a tree is. And this is the case for all human knowing, that we already inherit a sort of set of linguistic categories that we don't come up with individually. And so we learn through socialization these linguistic usages that this, in a sense, already tell us what the world is or what's going on, as a kind of intersubjective network of understandings that is not personally volitional. And so this is, in hermeneutics, this is called that there's a certain prehension or pre-having that we have to our knowledge, that we already have a certain kind of understanding of the world that is precognitive, and then our moment-to-moment cognition comes along and functions in terms of that already existing background of understandings to then know about and relate to the world. Now, if this is what's called the hermeneutical circle, meaning that our understanding has a kind of circularity to it. It already presupposes that it's already there. And so this is what Crowley means when he says that we already know what we are finding out, in a sense. And so truth is something that we know because we already know it. And so what we really have to do is unpack our hermeneutical pre-having, or rather what the kind of being it is that has this kind of pre-having. Namely, that to understand truth, we need to understand the being that it is that it has or is in the truth. And I'm just going to give you the answer right now. It turns out that that being is the human being, is human existence. And so the hermeneutical circle is grounded in a certain type of existentiality, or a certain type of mode of being that human beings have, that is also specifically related to our ability to use language. And this language use that we have opens up a kind of world for us that has all these types of relationships in it that is not available, say, to a plant. That a plant just, it's plopped in the ground and it grows, but it doesn't know that it's growing. It just is. But a human being can know that it is. In other words, its being can be an issue to itself. And this special quality of human existence is what Martin Heidegger calls Dasein, or kind of being there, meaning that we can thematize for ourselves our own existence, and therefore ask, as it were, the question of being, which is another way of asking the question of truth. And in a sense, this is what Crowley is talking about in this paragraph, and then also in this chapter. So when he talks about external correspondence or internal coherence, what he's talking about are different types of 20th century philosophy that were attempting to prove truth rather than presuppose it. So for example, there's what's called the correspondence theory of truth, which is the idea that our language has the meaning it does because it if I have a noun and I say the word tree, that there's some kind of correspondence between the word and the object, such that this connection or correlation is true, and therefore that I can know that this is a true statement. Now, it turns out that philosophically, it's completely impossible to make it clear what the basis for this correlation would be. And so, although there's a lot of work done on this, particularly in early analytical philosophy, it's generally considered by most philosophers today that this doesn't work and kind of fails and is a dead end for philosophy. But dead ends are important because they tell you that a particular trajectory isn't working out and that you need to explore a different paradigm. And when he talks about internal coherence, what he's talking about is a particular type of correspondence theory of truth, particularly advocated early on by Bertrand Russell, although he did later abandon it, that was based on the idea that you might be able to just use logic as the basis for understanding how language has a certain necessary structure that would allow it to have this correspondence. And again, that approach to philosophy, although there's a lot of work that's done in the early 20th century to analytical philosophy in the Anglo-American tradition on this idea, and with figures like Bertrand Russell or Quine or whatever, and especially a group called the logical positivists, who were obsessed with the idea that they could get this to work. And then by the 20s and 30s, this philosophical movement is kind of broken down, and it's becoming clear that it's not tenable. And another philosopher by the name of Ludwig Wittgenstein is a person who's particularly responsible for critiquing logical positivism and these other approaches and showing that they weren't tenable, and then developing a more of what we could call either a pragmatic or hermeneutical approach, although he himself doesn't use that language. But Martin Heidegger is also part of that rejection of the correspondence theory, and also a slightly earlier American-based type of philosophy that's called pragmatism, whose main advocate is a philosopher by the name of William James, and Crowley was a reader of William James. William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, a famous book that he wrote where he advocates the philosophy of pragmatism as a way to study religion, is very prominent on the AA reading list. And Crowley is very much an advocate of that philosophical approach. And this is why at a certain point early on, he changes what he describes Crowley's own philosophical position from what he was calling agnosticism, which is a kind of older late 19th century terminology, and he begins to call himself a pragmatist. And that comes directly from reading William James and from American pragmatism. And that's why Crowley is situated in this kind of anti-foundationalist tradition that other philosophers like Wittgenstein, like Heidegger, are also part of. And so that's why Crowley's philosophy is kind of congruent with and parallel with, and can also be related to these other philosophies. And that's why using the phenomenological method, which has been our method for this class, is a potentially effective method to understand the Thelemic philosophy, because all these streams of ideas kind of connect together in this way. Okay, so then, and again, this involves a kind of critical movement beyond Platonism, because in the Platonic tradition, truth with a capital T is established through the participation of the soul in the divine forms. And so that's the correspondence in question that is supposed to allow for truth to exist in this transitory world. And this comes up in Plato's Republic, where at one point in the dialogue, they're talking about how you would have two sticks that were the same length. And you would say, okay, these two sticks are the same length. But at the same time, you know that they're not exactly the same length. And so how then can you know or say that they're the same length? How can there be truth? What is truth? And this becomes the issue. And Plato thought that he could solve that problem by positing truth in another different supernatural world. And then things in this world, particularly souls, would then participate in this other world. And then through that participation, we could then somehow know what the truth is. And that's the philosophy that the Chaldean oracles are still moving in. So Crowley is not rejecting the idea that we could know truth, but he's changing the coordinates of the system of reference within which that is understood. And so when he's talking about truth, we could say he's talking about truth or truths plural with a lowercase t, rather than truth singular with a capital T. He's talking about pragmatic or practical truths, which we're able to know as human beings through social language usages that have a kind of adequation with our world experience. But this is a practical rather than a metaphysical matter. But then there's a kind of deeper insight, which is, what is this being that has this ability to know what the truth is? There must be something special about this being. And so then we can kind of reconstruct a kind of mysticism, a kind of spirituality based on that, but it will no longer be an otherworldly spirituality. It's no longer going to put the divine in another world. It's going to recognize that what we experience as the divine is within this world, and is in fact united with our deepest human existentiality, our deepest human being, or being in the world. Okay, so let me make sure I hit all the ideas. Okay, so then again, the question is, what is truth? And then the question then, in what precise sense can it be said that we already know or are the answer to this question? Okay, let's move on to second paragraph. Henry, could you read us this second paragraph?
Consider the statement of the angel in the fifth aether and the vision and the voice. All the symbols are interchangeable, for each one containeth in itself its own opposite. And this is the great mystery of the supernals that are beyond the abyss. For below the abyss, contradiction is division, but above the abyss, contradiction is unity. And there could be nothing true except by virtue of the contradiction that is contained in itself. When that was given to the master theory, and how obscure a saying and how hard that seemed to him. Yet in light of the above paragraphs, how simply obvious the proposition has become, and how far short of truth.
Truth with a capital T, but not short of truths with a lowercase t and plural. This quotation from the Vision and the Voice, the symbols, meaning language, is all practically interchangeable, and everything contains its own opposite within itself to be complete. And he says, this is the great mystery of the supernals. For below the abyss, contradiction is division, but above the abyss, contradiction is unity. Because things are true only by virtue of containing their own contradiction within themselves. This is an exactly precise statement of what in Hegel's dialectic is called the speculative notion. In other words, this statement here in the Vision of the Voice is exactly and precisely a restatement of the basic point of Hegel's logic. And in fact, this idea comes from Crowley's reading of Hegel's philosophy. And this is why I think it's not just some kind of a coincidence that certain ideas in Thelemic philosophy seem similar to Hegel's philosophy. It's because they are similar to Hegel's philosophy. This is the philosophical genealogy that Crowley derives these ideas for, and that they find their way into Thelema. And again, this just deepens the connection between Thelema and the deepest currents of modern philosophy. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, it means that the true totality or unity is that which encompasses or comprehends within itself its own opposite or negation. And conversely, and this says the same thing, that things have their essence outside of themselves in their context and circumstance, rather than, and in their relation to that context and circumstance, rather than the Platonic idea, which is that things have their essence inside of themselves as a kind of otherworldly metaphysical form or soul that then gives them their particular qualities. And what Hegel does is he inverts that, and he says that essence is not, in other words, another way to put this, and this is the way that the philosopher Slavoj Žižek says. He says that the basic insight of German idealism, Hegel's dialectic, is that if the metaphysical tradition of philosophy, of Platonism, says that everything, in order to be itself, has a metaphysical essence that is within it, Hegel's dialectic is the idea that everything has its essence, but its essence comes from outside of itself, not from inside of itself. So it's a kind of concretization, a kind of perspective upon its context. And this, I claim, is what Crowley means by when he talks about the star self as being a point of view or a point of end. In other words, it's a kind of pure perspective that has no content in itself, except that it's a point of hermeneutical orientation towards some specific and unique historical context, which can then, when totalized or organized in terms of that point of view, can then have a meaning, can then have a true will in its experience, and that it can posit for itself. And this is the way that you immanentize the divine, so that it's not in another world. It is, in fact, expressing itself through every unique point event of reality, every quantum fluctuation that probabilistically, determines itself in some particular form, is a spark of the divine, is some coming into being of some potentiality that then has its own internally coherent dynamic and truth as it will. And so then Thelemic spirituality then becomes the search for the coherent, critical, and confident understanding of that truth, so that we can then live that truth. Okay, so another way to put this is that this point event or quality of an existent, namely human existence, is a kind of vanishing point. You can't locate it, but it's not an object or thing itself, certainly not in another world. But nevertheless, it's a kind of orientation that has oriented a particular zone of worlding or world experience that's coming into being around it. And this means that as in terms of our existentiality, Dasein, or human existence, is its historical existing. So in other words, we are our true will as an activity, not an object. Or as Crowley puts it in MTP at one point, magic is a verb rather than a noun. And that kind of summarizes it right there. Okay, let's look at some quotes from the Chaldean oracles here. So Hillary, if you could take us to read this paragraph. What then can be meant?
What then can be meant by the title of this compilation, Little Essays Toward Truth? Do we not all assume a perfectly logical conception of truth as
illogical conception?
pardon me. Perfectly illogical conception of truth as an entity of the super mundane order, whence a whirling flame and flying light subsist.
That's a quotation from the oracles. Keep going.
Do we not instinctively assimilate these ideas of truth and light, though there is no rational nexus?
In other words, they're a hermeneutical presupposition of our that we understand because it's already our mode of being to express these things. We don't need to rationally understand them. They presuppose our rationality. Keep going.
Is it not clear then that we do understand each other perfectly, so far as we can understand each other at all, in a sphere as such as Zoroaster calls intelligible?
Or
which,
linguistic intelligibility, our shared language usages that allow us to, on a practical level, understand and comprehend each other. Keep going, please.
which subsisteth beyond mind.
Or as a hermeneutical presupposition that is the background to our mental activity. Keep going.
Ooh. But which we should seek to grasp with the flower of mind. Must we not then assent to that other oracle, in which that magus most sublime asserts?
And that magus is Zoroaster, the supposed author of this text. Go ahead and read us this quote here for the king.
Okay, I may have to have you.
We'll scroll up a little bit. How's that?
Okay. There, well, it's a little better. Yeah. For the king of all previously placed before the polymorphous world a type, intellectual, incorruptible, the imprint of whose form is sent forth through the world, by which the universe shone forth decked with ideas all various, of which the foundation is one and alone.
Okay, so this intellectual and incorruptible imprint is the logos, but that is just language itself. The language that allows for us to have an intelligible understanding of the world. And its foundation is one, meaning the one united world, not divided up. See, I mean, you see how I'm reinterpreting this text? And so then the one then is the single world that we're in that isn't divided up into a supernatural and immanent world, but is in fact one world that we find ourselves in as human beings, intersubjectively sharing our one world together, that which is called in phenomenology the life world, that we all interact with each other within. And then keep reading where it says, from this the others.
From this the others rush forth, distributed and separated through the various bodies of the universe.
These are the daimons, the diverse spirits that are permeating through the world that can then be manipulated through magic, which is to say through linguistic signifiers. Keep going.
Where was I?
And are born in swarms.
And are born in swarms through its vast abysses, ever whirling forth in illimitable radiation. They are intellectual conceptions from the paternal fountain, partaking abundantly of the brilliance of fire in the culmination of unresting time. But the primary self-perfect fountain of the Father poured forth these primogenial ideas.
Okay, so you see how there's both a Platonic interpretation of that. This could be the otherworldly supernatural one, but there's also a pragmatic kind of modern magical interpretation of these, where all these categories are immanent within human existence. These are all our own capabilities that are not in another world, but are rather functions of Dasein, functions of our existentiality, which then posits us within a world such that we are able to know who we, at least potentially, who we are and what we're doing. And we have the recourse of the spiritualization of that world through language, that through symbolization we can manipulate ourselves and our understanding of the world through magic to optimize our potential of being through our interaction with this theurgic and thaumaturgic functions. Okay, so now let's look at where it says it is to be remembered. Henry, if you could pick us up here and go ahead and read both these two paragraphs, it is to be remembered, and then the next one.
It is to be remembered that the oracles of Zoroaster continually proclaim in words of boundless brilliancy the doctrines here set forth. These essays are indeed a species of commentary thereupon, and I may say that I only came to understand them as perfectly as I now do in the course of this writing. Now this same truth, which is light, which is implicit in each spark of the intelligible, what is it but the self of every man? It is this that informs his every motion, this that lies closest to his heart and soul, being indeed their mainspring and their dial, the principle of section and of measure.
Okay, and so he's just restating what I just said, which is that the nexus of this gnosis is ourselves. We're the mainspring of the dial, the principle of measure, because we're the ones who measure. So therefore, we're the basis of the principle of measure. It informs the motion of the self of the everyman, because we are that which moves, and so we or comprehends or understands the world about us. We are that being for which being our own being is an issue to ourselves, and who therefore are implicitly then able to understand ourselves in those terms. And therefore we can seek a kind of authenticity of our existence within our being. And this is what Crowley calls the true will. And again, all these otherworldly categories of Neoplatonic theurgy are in Thelema fully immanentized. They're expressions of our being within the world. Okay, and then he's going to make this point again. Hilary, if you could pick up where it says, now initiation is by etymology.
Now, initiation is, by etymology, the journey inwards. It is the voyage of discovery, O wonder world of one's own soul. And this is truth that stands upon the prow, eternally alert. This is truth that sits with one strong hand gripping the helm. It sounds like Resh. Truth is our path, and truth is our goal. Aye, there shall come to all a moment of great light when the path is seen to be itself the goal. And in that hour, every one of us shall exclaim, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Yea, the life also, life eternal in time and boundless in space. For what is life but the continual resolution of the antinomy of the diverse by the spasm of love under will? That is, by the constantly explosive, the orgiastic perception of truth, the dissolution of individuality in one radiant star of truth that ever revolveth and goeth and filleth the heavens with light.
And this star that he's describing is the star of our own being, that the Book of the Law says every man and every woman is a star in this sense. So the path is the goal, And this is the truth, which is that we are therefore the truth. And that's why you get this quotation from the Gospels, where this is, of course, originally attributed to Jesus, where he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And the point is that all of us get to say that. We're not projecting this onto some other external figure, whether that's God or some higher plane of reality, or Jesus, who's this other being that's supposed to save us if we believe in him, or whatever. But whatever those messianic attributes are, they are innate, not to some special, unique being, but to all of us are special, unique beings that have this attribute. And so the Gnostic position, which is the position of gnosis, which is knowledge, which is different from the position of pistis, which is faith or belief. The position of knowledge is that we acknowledge and attempt to understand how this is the case for us individually, and we use magic as the tool to do that. And this is different from, say, traditional Christianity, where the idea is that you're supposed to instead put your faith in some external entity who's supposed to save you after you die somehow. And so for Thelema, we have to save ourselves within our own life and not wait for some otherworldly, world transcending salvation, but to realize this here and now, as it were. And so that's why every one of us shall exclaim, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Okay, so what are these categories here? The divine life is what in Liber 10, one of the holy books, is described as the life which abideth in light. Okay, the light is the self-illumination of gnosis, where we know who we are and what we're doing. This is the lux, the LVX that we're seeking in magic. And this self-illumination is in terms, of course, of the true will. And so all these categories, life, truth, the way, etc., are different viewpoints on the basic theme of the going of the star self. And so what that means is that life is equivalent to love, which is equivalent to will, which is equivalent to truth, which is equivalent to light, which is equivalent to life. And we go back around in a circle. And so all these ideas are just different perspectives on the same basic underlying idea, which is that we are the truth, which then expresses itself as light, life, love, liberty, will, etc. Whatever other magical categories you want to, which are ultimately categories of the expression of our own deepest and most authentic potentiality for being. Okay, let's now go to some more quotations from the Chaldean oracles. Henry, I think it's your turn. If you could pick up where it says, I beseech you earnestly, dear brethren.
I beseech you earnestly, dear brethren, to grapple manfully as mighty wrestlers with the ideas in these little essays, to understand them with the extended flame of far-reaching mind, measuring all things except that intelligible. But it is requisite to understand this, for if thou inclinest thy mind, thou wilt understand it, not earnestly. But it is becoming to bring with thee a pure and inquiring sense, to extend the void mind of thy soul so that intelligible, that thou mayest learn the intelligible, because it subsisteth beyond mind.
Keep reading through this next paragraph here.
For thus, not only will you develop the spiritual intuition, the very neshama of your divine being, but in the degree of your concentration, of your power to slow down and finally to stop the irritable movements of your ratiocinative machinery, to transmute these essays, the prima materia of your great work, passing them through the stage of the black dragon in which your rational ideas are wholly destroyed and putrefied, you will succeed in inflaming them in the fierce furnace of your creative wills until all things burn up together into one blazing mass of living, of relentless light.
Okay, so in this passage, Crowley interprets the term intelligible in the Chaldean oracles as referring to neshama, which is the wholeness of the psyche, the wholeness of the self. This is Jung's self archetype, the self with a capital S, which is the totality of the psyche, the conscious and unconscious minds in full comprehension and comprehension of each other. And then he interprets the phrase mind, which is what is to then raise itself to the intelligible, as being the ruach, which is the function of self-consciousness to integrate itself with nefesh, the unconscious, and thus to disclose the wholeness of the psyche through the resolution of the unconscious complexes through magic as a kind of therapy, basically. And then this discloses neshama, which then arises as the function of the unification of the unconscious and conscious halves of the selves as they are able to reunite. And this is this alchemical process. And it's carried out through the fiery energy. Remember, energy is this libidinal affectivity that gives purpose to our mentation. And this is the fire, the tapas of the yogic heat that is able to gradually consume the complexes of the unconscious and release the latent energy of our being so that we're able to achieve this unification. And so again, we see here Crowley is reinterpreting the original dualist sense of this passage, where in its original Platonic context, mind is, of course, nous, or the soul. Nous is N-O-U-S, which is a term in Greek. It just means mind or soul, but in a Platonic sense. And then, of course, the intelligible is this supernatural domain of the forms. And instead, what's happening here is this universal soul or spirit is in fact the spirit with a capital S of what Hegel calls Geist, which is human social collectivity, the intersubjective medium where within which the life world appears and we move and live and have our being in company with the other star selves. It's what the Book of the Law calls the company of heaven, this ideal human social collectivity. And its medium is language, is what allows for the iterability of this space of collectivity to be able to appear and manifest itself. And therefore it's manipulable by language, which is of course the function of magic, which uses symbolic signs and symbols, which are modes of language used to manipulate the phenomenological life world in various ways, subtle as well as overt, to cause change and conformity with will, the ultimate will, of course, being the true will. And so ultimately what's happening in the Thelema then, at least as I'm interpreting it in this course, I hope non-dogmatically, no, I'm not requiring anybody to agree with me, I'm just laying out the schema, laying out the categories, is that what was originally the supernatural dualism of the old eon of Osiris, it's represented by Platonic metaphysics, has now been naturalized. And yet this naturalization provides the very unification that was sought in the ancient mysteries. In other words, the divine and human that seem to be separated into these other worlds are in fact now it's able to comprehend and understand how they always already were unified. And now the job is just to make this more explicit and explore the potential of that understanding. And this, of course, is the answer that the book has been leading towards with our question, what is truth? And these are the essays towards truth, which is, of course, that we are the truth. And so, Hillary, if you could pick up here where it says, and thus ye come, and thus come ye, etc., and then read this quotation.
And thus come ye to Sama Samadhi. Thus are you free forever of all the bonds that bound your Godhead. A similar fire, flashingly extending through the rushings of air, or a fire formless, whence cometh the image of a voice, or even a flashing light abounding, revolving, whirling forth, crying aloud. Also, there is the vision of the fire flashing courser of light, or else a child borne aloft on the shoulders of the
celestial steed, fiery or clothed with gold, or naked, or shooting with the bow shafts of light, and standing on the shoulders of the horse. Then, if thy meditation prolongeth itself, thou shalt unite all these symbols into the form of a lion.
And then Henry, if you could read this last bit.
Then ye shall understand what is truth, for ye shall understand yourselves, and ye are truth.
Okay, there we go. That just makes the point that I was just making. And by the way, Sama Samadhi, that just means great Samadhi. And it means you've come to a kind of one-pointed attention on this gnosis that we've been discussing, on this particular understanding, and then you're trying to live that understanding. And then it ends with this passage from the Chaldean oracles, in which, if we want to interpret this thelemically, we could see that here we have a vision of the crowned and conquering child, Horus, the child borne aloft on the shoulders of a celestial steed, fiery, shooting arrows of will. And then in the end, you shall unite these symbols into a form of a lion, which is the lion of light. And Crowley then identifies himself as the great beast with this lion of light who utters forth the prophecy of the new eon and makes it all explicit in a way that he hopes, the hope of the Magus is that people will understand the gnosis and share in their enlightenment. Okay, we have now completed reading this text, and we've got a few minutes left, and I would love it if we could have just a little bit of discussion, and this could be about anything that we've talked about during the book. I know you've both been here for many of the sections that we've gone through, so this is our kind of last 10 or 12 minutes or so. Let's if you've got any questions or comments, we can have a kind of closing discussion about what we've been learning about in this course.
I have a
Yes, please.
question. I'm not sure how well formulated it is, but
That's fine. Go for it.
I'll give it a shot. So
Awesome.
I'm curious where the scientific method fits into all this. I feel like we've sort of hinted at, like, okay, we're trying to approach this from a sort of non-superstitious and to a certain degree kind of like non-mystical, or at least not mystical in the way that certain other traditions are mystical. So there's that on the one hand, but on the other hand, I feel like we're talking about super rational concepts that can only be understood from a purely subjective point of view.
He's using that terminology, but it's been recontextualized in a more modern philosophical sense. So all that terminology derives from traditional dualistic Osirian, if you will, mysticism and exoteric religion. But the esoteric thelemic understanding is to kind of immanentize it in the way that we have. And you asked an excellent question where you asked, where does the scientific method come into this? And the answer to that is that the for Crowley, the scientific method has to do with empiricism. And so the scientific method enters into the fact that regardless of how wonderful this philosophy might have been on the page, you have to figure out how to implement it in your own life. You have to test it by practicing it and prove or disprove it in your own experience. And that's the empirical element. And to the extent that that involves a kind of self-critical element where you keep a diary and you keep track of what you're doing and you try to be objective and so forth about it, that's where the kind of scientific method, in a way, enters into it as a kind of practical procedure for actually experientially actualizing what is otherwise just a kind of wonderful but still prosaic philosophical theory. So that's the point where you start getting into the place where something like a scientific method is entering in, and also the idea that none of this is to be taken on faith. So this is all a nice this is a nice, wonderful description, but it's useless if you just decide that this is great and so this is now what you believe. Okay, that's wonderful, but so what? Unless you can actualize it, it doesn't have the meaning that it's supposed to. And so, well, how do you actualize it? Well, you need to run some experiments. So like Mahatma Gandhi talks about his experiments with truth. That's the kind of idea here, is that here we are in the 21st century, and we're inheriting this 2,000-year-old, more than that, really, it's primordial, Western or really universal esoteric tradition. And there's all kinds of scholarship that helps us orient in terms of understanding its content. But ultimately, the goal is to, if it is about a certain truth, we have to embody that truth. We have to be that truth. And so that means we have to run some experiments. We have to start experimenting practically with what this is supposed to mean, not just abstractly, but concretely in our own life. And we can only do that by starting to experiment with magic, for example. So we have to do some rituals and do some meditation and observe then empirically what happens, and then try to do so objectively, take notes, have a record, compare the record, have other people run these experiments, compare our record with other people's records, and then it becomes this kind of dialogue. And as in science, none of this it's not appropriate to treat this as a kind of dogmatic truth that's supposed to be either obeyed or believed. We have to try to understand experientially what this could mean for us, and that requires experimentation. And that would be where, for Crowley, something like a scientific method comes into play on the level of method. Henry, I don't know if that
Yeah, I think that is definitely helpful. I think there's still a little I have trouble sort of holding in mind this idea that we're like using this method to say like record or take notes. I just naturally conflate that with some notion that what's being recorded is some kind of like objective reality,
sure, and that maybe
or
isn't.
whether it's our subjective experience that's being mediated through this linguistic lens.
Yes.
So it's personal.
So there's different kinds of scientific method. So Crowley is not a scientific positivist in the sense that, some scientists think that this is the sort of Richard Dawkins version of science, where science is just completely objectively true. And so those who accept that know what the truth is, and people who don't accept that or ask too many questions are just kind of dumb idiots that need to be kind of abused in debates. And Crowley is not, because Crowley is a pragmatist. And so pragmatism is concerned with the complex ways in which social usages are used to allow us to relate in diverse ways with reality. In terms of, so for example, William James doesn't talk about a universe, he talks about a pluriverse that has many different possible meanings that you could have, different strategies of description. So there would be many different kinds of science, different kinds of scientific knowing, all of which are potentially valid depending on what the context is of their use. Ludwig Wittgenstein talks about what he calls the degree of fit between different language games and our world of circumstances. And so for him, finding a particular degree of fit between a particular language game and some set of circumstances is what's meant by truth. Rather, he doesn't assert that there's a universal meaning for truth. And so again, these notions of science are maybe not the same as what we could call as kind of scientific positivism, but it doesn't mean that they aren't still, in some meaningful philosophical sense, namely a pragmatic sense, scientific. Remember, there's many different ways to understand what science is. So in 19th century German philosophy, science, Geschichte, or you could use a Wissenschaft maybe as a kind of cognate term, That just means any kind of well-grounded knowledge, but it could be diverse the way that it's grounded. You could have different kind of strategies for understanding that. And that's then what they call science. The idea that there's only one method or way to approach truth, and then when you do that, you know what the truth with the capital T is. It's a kind of reintroduction of a certain type of metaphysical thinking into science. And it's probably, in my opinion, speaking from a philosophical point of view, is probably actually a bad way to do science. But it is a way that, especially for a lot of undergraduates at that level, it is a popular way in the popular imagination, especially for people to think of what science is. And I would propose that that's a naive view, and that from a more, there are more complex philosophical ways to understand how science works, that understand it in a more complex and diverse way, that aren't so naively positivistic. And Crowley is, I think, more aligned with that type of approach through his connection with pragmatism. Is that, Hillary, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was going to ask you as a follow-up question. You keep talking about pragmatic Platonism. Who's associated with this?
Oh, pragmatism and Platonism are two different philosophies that are in fact opposed to each other.
Oh, opposed. Okay.
Yeah, they're different philosophies, and they're actually oppositional. Pragmatism is a criticism of Platonism, an attempt to overcome it in philosophy. It's a modern philosophical position. It derives its name from William James, who's an American philosopher, early 20th century. He wrote a book that's on the AA reading list that I highly recommend, that's called The Varieties of Religious Experience. This book is in print. There's a Penguin Classics edition of it. It's a great book, well worth reading. If you read that, it will explain to you what pragmatism is. Pragmatism is the idea that words or concepts have their meaning based on their use, rather than based on some kind of objective truth that is human independent. Truth is human relational. It's based on social language usages, and can't be kind of separated from that context. So it's kind of subjectively objective. And if that doesn't make sense, we've only got 3 minutes left, so I have to refer you to that text by William James, which is an excellent book and well worth checking out, and has all kinds of relationships to the AA system of magic and also to Crowley's philosophy. Platonism, of course, derives from the writings of Plato, and are a bunch of Greek dialogues, and that informs one of the major philosophical traditions of the ancient world. That, and this is basically the idea that this world can be made sense of by appeal to another supernatural world. And through philosophizing about the nature of this heavenly or supernatural world, we can then understand how this world works. And so it's therefore called dualism, because it posits that there are two worlds, basically. There's this world, the world of experience, but then there's another supernatural world that needs to be posited to explain this world. And more modern systems of philosophy, like pragmatism, reject that distinction. And they want to posit that there's just one world, which is this world. And if we want to understand it, we have to understand it in terms of this, of the world that we're within, rather than positing other worlds to explain how things work in this one.
And the Golden Dawn's involvement was,
well, they start, they're what they're
Platonism?
called, yes, they're derived from what's called Neoplatonism, which is a type of magical Platonism that is going on in the late Roman Empire. And a kind of version of that is called Hermeticism. And this is a philosophy that's revived in early modernity and the Renaissance. And when this gets revived, it also revives the practice of pagan magic. And so the Golden Dawn is practicing pagan magic in the context of this thing called Hermeticism. But then Crowley comes along and he wants to be more modern with the philosophy, because he's a pragmatist rather than a Platonic dualist. And so that's how he starts to play around with the different philosophical categories. And in that sense, to develop his own philosophy, which is called Thelema, to replace or modify Hermeticism, which was the philosophy that the Golden Dawn's magical system was based on. Now, he's still practicing the same magical system. All he's done is update the philosophy that underlies it. It's all still pagan magic. It's just that it's now neo-pagan magic because it's occurring in modern times. So it has to be updated accordingly. And Crowley is trying to do that with his own philosophy. Does that make sense?
Thank you. That's very useful.
Please read this book by William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. It's a wonderful book. Anybody can read it. It's very accessible. It will explain better than I can in the remaining 10 seconds or so of this class what all these distinctions mean. William James is a great writer. Anyway, we have to stop because it's 4 o'clock. Thank you both for joining us. And we have now successfully completed this course. So thanks, everybody. Love is the law. Love under will.